Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of War and Conquest. I know I promised you guys last week we would finish the Siege of Malta, but I lied. Don't feel bad though, because I lied to myself too. I thought it was going to be ready, but then this interview sort of fell into my lap, and I said, "Hey, it buys me an extra 2 weeks of research." So, everybody at War and Conquest, let's give a nice welcome to today's historian to interview, Bruce Ware Allen.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, the reason I reached out to Bruce is he wrote definitely like one of the best books I've read from contemporary historians. You know, the story of Malta is interesting in and of itself, but there's a lot of historians, at least of the books that I found, that really fell short of telling the entire story until I found the topic of today's discussion, Bruce's book, The Great Siege of Malta. So do you want to what inspired you to do this, to undertake writing this book to begin with?
Well, it came around in circles. I had read an article, chanced on it years ago on the Battle of Lepanto and thought, hey, that's a good subject. Didn't take it up, which is just as well because Niccolo Capone and Hugh Bacino did so in the meantime and did far better work than I would have done on it. But reading that, it kept taking me back further to Malta, which it's just, there's everything going on in Malta. You had to go there. And I'd seen that nobody had done anything with Malta since like 1965 when Ernley Bradford did his basic general history about it. But that was 50 years ago, and it's some problems of source and interpretation. I'd originally thought of doing this as a novel because, it's a story, many characters, many incidents. But once I started doing that, all of a sudden this story, which had been ignored for years, started popping up all over the place. There were about half a dozen novels on the subject. Okay, so somebody else is doing that, and I had already started doing the research. I might as well go into making it into nonfiction.
It's interesting because, it seems like every historian of this period I read loves to throw out the Voltaire quote, like the most well-known event in European history is the Siege of Malta. But yet there's comparatively like few books that survive today that we can really draw for sources of this like entire event. Like you'd think there'd be more people writing about something this significant that we would have today to look for our archival footage or records, I mean.
Well, it was interesting at the time, there was a whole lot of up-to-the-minute reports going to embassies, or call them state departments in England and France and Spain, updates that are really short. Most of them have been lost because, they were like 3 or 4 pages. And like newspapers today, who's going to keep them? But they are out there. They're usually not very interesting, but it does show that people are paying attention at the time.
I guess sort of my blind side to that is I don't have access to those like really like deep historical archives that historians or people who are writing books like this can get to. I just sort of get I can find some primary sources, and I can find like people who have written about the event in the past like 100 years or so. But I guess for the common viewer, it's harder to get a hold of a lot of these little snippets that have been preserved throughout the years.
You're absolutely right. On the other hand, it has gotten a whole lot easier in the last 20 years. When I started doing this, I was going to rare book rooms, New York and Rome and elsewhere, but stuff that I was finding and taking photographs of, because that's how hard they were to get a hold of, now they're on the internet. So there's all sorts of stuff that, thank God for Google Books, but not just them. It's also the national libraries of places like France and Germany and so on, who are putting all this stuff out there. So this book would not have been possible without the internet, certainly not in the form that it is now. So,
oh yeah, the the magical thinking boxes do seem to make our lives easier when it comes, especially to archiving, because you know
Yeah.
you can train a computer like, listen, these are the keywords we're looking for. If somebody types it in, this is what you get, which is something that would have taken, you know, a team of dozens of people, you know, years in the past to do. You know, a few button presses away, and boom, there it is.
Yeah, and you would have missed a whole lot of anyway. I mean, it's that having been said, there are also things that are not totally well indexed, but I was able to find them through sort of secondhand through lists of that scholars had made back in even the 19th century. Do a word search for that, and you know, that's how I came up with a few things in the secret archives of Genoa. You wouldn't expect anything there, and you'd never find it on your own, but you know, there it is listed on this hopelessly obscure book to begin with.
Is that kind of like the fun of the historian's job, is like to go digging through these archives, and then you can find something that, at least when you find it, you can feel like, I may be the first person to have made this connection.
Yeah.
I mean, I get that sometimes when I'm writing this show. Like, I'll be reading someone else's work and I'll be looking at like the evidence, and I'm like, they missed the point. Like, I see something totally different to this story. And I mean, I've never gone on like an archive dive like you have. So, but I can imagine that feeling of being the person. It's like, wow, I may have been the first person to connect these two dots together.
That's absolutely the case. It's fun.
So like when you're, I mean, for something like this, like, how do you, like, what's your, I don't know where to ask this question. Like, what's your approach? Like when you're looking to tackle a new story, like what's the first thing you dive into when it comes to research?
I hate to say it, but Wikipedia. And the only reason I go there, yeah, I know that's the point, is to see what is generally out there. What is the first thing other people can go for? I don't care about the articles, but I do care about what sources they have. Who are they pointing you to? If there's anything interesting there, then you know, from there you take it to things like JSTOR to see what the academics are doing, and then just do word searches on appropriate material. Of source material, you know, there is no end, particularly something like this, and you can spend days digging for a particular individual. And I tend to be fairly, I dive deep more than I should, if I'm honest. But I also like to get to the earliest possible mention of anything. And you don't always get there. I mean, there's a commentary of that comes up in all modern works of when Charles kicked the Jews and the Muslims out of Spain. A lot of them went to Constantinople. Well, that's interesting. And the quote always comes up. The Sultan was astonished and said, I can't believe that he's kicking out something so valuable and just letting me pick it up, or words to that effect. This quote comes up all the time. I have never found who came up with it first.
I suppose that happens. Like, are you familiar with the Mandela effect? Have you heard of that before?
Oh, I have, and I can't define it because I have a memory like a sieve.
Well, nobody does, but it's essentially like, it's things that have been sort of passed through the cultural filter that are incorrect, but everybody believes them. Like what everybody points to is the Berenstain Bears. Everybody calls them Berenstain Bears. Right. Or like the quote, Luke, I am your father. It's actually, no, I am your father.
Right.
So it's, I wonder if it's things like that, you know, it's just one of those stories that got picked up and sort of circulated through the culture. And then, you know, one chronicler was writing it down, like, oh, I heard Suleiman said that, you know, thank you for all the Jews, Charles.
It may be true, but it's just that nobody can cite the original thing. The story that comes up in the Siege of Malta is I mean, you're familiar with the point where the Valette shoots the heads of Turkish prisoners from cannons. And that turns up in pretty much every standard bit, but it never sounded quite right to me. I finally traced it back to a French historian named Vertot in the 17th century. He's the first one who says cannons. Everybody before that simply says he threw the heads over the wall. So it's a greater image to say, yeah, you did it with cannons, but you have to think if he had really done that, everybody else who was writing about this beforehand would have thrown in that detail because it's too good to miss. And Vertot makes up a whole lot of other stuff as well. He's fun to read, but he's not the most reliable of historians. But
at the same time, I can see what you're saying, though, because, I mean, for one, Lavalette's a practical guy. He knows he only has a limited supply of gunpowder, and he needs to use it exactly where he needs it. So one, why waste gunpowder blowing Turkish heads off the walls when you can just have guys throw them over by hand?
Right. And you could argue that, this is a deception. It's like we're running out of powder, but they'll never know it because we're wasting it on throwing heads. I don't buy that. But.
Also, I don't think a head is going to do very well out of a cannon.
That was another thing. And, it's, again, one of those stories that you hear about, but has anybody ever really tried this? And it's one of the things for Mythbusters, if they could ever.
It's funny because I just made a joke about this on the recent show. We were talking about the thistles of iron and grape shot. And I was joking about how, like, all these YouTubers who have cannons who show you how grape shot works, you never get to see it used against actual people. They shoot it against a piece of plywood or a barn door or a car.
Right.
Like, we've never seen what this stuff does when it goes through a infantry formation of 60 guys.
Yeah, well, probably hard to get funding and permission for that sort of test.
But yeah, I'd imagine the volunteers would be the most difficult, at least initial hurdle to making this, unless you tricked them. You just got a bunch of homeless people and told them there was free food out in the middle of this field. You're sitting there with a cannon with a load of canister shot ready to go. I mean, I wouldn't do that, but I mean, there's somebody out there who's probably thought about it.
Well, people think too much.
Well, there's definitely humans definitely get up to some dark things whenever we're left alone with our thoughts for too long. I think history definitely has a very thorough record of things like that happening.
Which makes this difficult trying to separate, did this really happen or did this not? I mean, if it's a really good story, you figure, well, it can't possibly be true. But then you look at what happened in the 20th century and in our own time, it's like, well, I don't know, maybe it did.
Well, I mean, for this siege especially, like, I drew a lot of inspiration off the Battle of Stalingrad, because it's essentially the same thing. It's a modern setting. There's a lot of artillery. There's a lot of broken down buildings, and both sides just absolutely refuse to give up, no matter like the odds stacked against them. They're both living in squalor. They're dying by the thousands of disease and whatever. But yet they just keep fighting because this battle is the most important thing that's happened in the past century.
Well, also giving up is just, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah. I mean, that was one thing I always found interesting, because, and this is essentially a 3-part trilogy I didn't plan. We started doing Mehmed II's conquest in the Balkans, and then we went back to the fall of Constantinople, and then now we're here.
Right.
The thing I always laughed about in the sources is how people kept surrendering to Mehmed II. Like, I get maybe the first 2 or 3 times people surrender and then you sack and enslave the entire city anyway. But like after the 3rd or 4th time, word should have gotten out. Like, this guy is not to be trusted. Like, any surrender terms, he's lying. Just fight to the death. And it's surprising that we don't see that more often against figures like him, who just took no prisoners no matter what. If you resist, you're all either dead or enslaved.
Well, hope springs eternal.
I guess that is true. People are, at the end of the day, we're all fueled by our own self-interest. At the end of the day, your body's literally programmed to keep you alive. So,
right.
I guess sometimes hope prevails even when it shouldn't. That's the lesson we never learn from our movies these days. Yeah. Sometimes the good guys are wrong. That's another lesson we learn from history. Is sometimes even the people you're rooting for, you get to a certain point in the story and you're like, oh, wait a minute. I shouldn't be rooting for this person.
Are there any real heroes? Probably, but it depends on what side you're on, I guess.
And when we give into that, we get the state of modern cinema, where everybody's an anti-hero or everybody's almost irredeemable. And it just doesn't make for a fun story anymore.
Well, I know at least one person who refuses to see any movie that's made that was made after he was born. He was born in the 50s, so.
Oh, he's going through a lot of old silent film archives at that point.
Yeah, well, good stuff back then.
Yeah.
There's too much to watch anyway, too much to read. Who's got time?
Yeah, I definitely find that. I find it especially difficult sometimes trying to force myself to research, and there's always like 15 other things that are pulling me in every other direction. It's like, oh, you got a new text message. Oh, you got this update. Oh, you got to do this. And then you're like, oh, wait, I opened this book a half an hour ago and I've only read 2 paragraphs since then. I need to go one of those like safe rooms where you don't get any like internet or cell reception. Just force myself to work sometimes.
Right.
I mean, we're both kind of here doing that now. I was supposed to be writing the finale for the episode. You were supposed to be doing, I don't know, whatever you were working on at the time, and yet here we are, just having a chat about history.
Always working on something, never stops.
So speaking of that, are you working? What's your next project coming down the pike? I'm
going back to ancient Rome. I've got 2 proposals out there. The agent's trying to sell them, but between certain reverses in the world economy right now, he's facing some trouble with that. COVID didn't help. So that's what's sort of holding it back. But
I feel like the time to be like publishing a book was like January to February 2020. Your book's out there, it's in circulation, and all of a sudden people are bored at home and they need something to read or they need something to do. And then if your book's ready right there, then you're good to go.
True enough. Unfortunately, it takes about 18 months from time of handing something in to actually getting it into the stores. So
have you submitted anything yet? Like, do you have anything that's like a?
Oh yeah, no, I've got a list of rejections of. So I don't know. I mean, the book buying decision by publishers these days is done by committee, so everybody gets a down vote, and so a publisher an editor can really like something, but if the salespeople say, I don't get it, it doesn't get bought. And I am told that even the Malta thing at certain places was the object of a certain amount of heated debate before some people turned it down.
You got to go the way of the historians of old. You just got to find like an Elon Musk type, one of those like rich people with money to burn. That's like, hey, I want you to just write history for me, and you can say, all right, there we go. I mean, it's worked for our ancestors for thousands of years, and now we've sort of abandoned that system.
It has, but it has interesting effects, and I'll tell you a story about that. One of the sources that I used was a guy named Vitorano. He was the archbishop in Messina during the siege, and being in Messina, he was sort of on the front line, or behind the front line, but everybody was moving through Messina, going back and forth, and that's where the Spanish commander, trying to get help to Malta during that period, was hanging out. He was asked to write a history of it at the time, which he did, and it's interesting. It's a good piece of work, and he dedicated it to who's the young man who ran Lepanto?
Don Juan.
Don Juan. He dedicated to him, who was like 16 at the time and had tried to sneak his way into the battle. And he wrote a nice little letter to him saying, look, good for you for trying to do the right thing here at Malta. And I dedicate this book to you because you're such a hell of a guy. Presumably because of that, he was next hired to go to Spain and become sort of the official historian. And he wrote a long piece on the Battle of Lepanto, which is I don't see anybody using it in any of the any later research. And finally, after that, he was hired to write the official Spanish account of how basically Philip II took over Portugal, which is a story of intrigue and something to get into. But the point of it was that each book you could see his enthusiasm declining, but he's doing it all because he's being on the Spanish payroll. So it was fun the first time, the second time, maybe not so much. The third time, look, I'm writing propaganda here and I know it.
It makes you wonder why why Philip II didn't pick up Francisco Balbi as a court historian, because man, that boy can write a story.
That's probably why he didn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I wish I could find something else that he wrote, because he's definitely one of the best primary source historians I've ever seen, both in like the detail, like his perspective, the fact that he was actually there, and the fact that it's an incredibly interesting story. Like I place him up in like the Julius Caesar Gallic Wars tier of primary history for entertainment and information you can glean about something.
You notice he did 2 editions of it. And the difference between them is the second one, he puts in a lot more names, presumably because he wants to sell more copies. This thing's picking up, but if you want somebody to actually buy the book, put their name in there. Friends and relatives will buy it.
I can respect, at least if we can believe him at face value, like his introduction to the book. He says, listen, this is the second edition. I've learned from more people I've interviewed since then. And now here's the second edition, which automatically makes me respect him as someone reading. Like, okay, this guy realized he made some mistakes and he corrected them. He added more perspective.
I don't disagree with you, and I don't disrespect him for it. In fact, I would have done the same. Frankly, I'd like to do a second edition of what I've done because I found out a lot more in the meantime. So, it's anytime you finish anything like this, you start getting letters and people saying, I think you'll find that, or I bet you didn't know. Well, no, it's true. I didn't. So
most of those letters I usually send to myself. Like I'll go back and I'll listen to my episode and I'm like, I'll think of the 15 ideas I had during the week that I forgot to talk about in the show. I'm like, oh, I forgot about that. Like, actually, I just had one of those moments now. You were talking about the heads being fired out of the cannons. Totally forgot to mention that. Like I had it in my head, but then I got sort of distracted with building up the dramatic moment of Lavalette standing on the battlements and saying, like, tell your sultan, this is the only ground I'll yield him. Tell him come, fill it with his janissaries. I got swept up in the moment, and then I forgot all about the heads getting blown out of the cannons.
Oh, well.
No, we're talking about it now. It counts. We're a month and a half late, but we're here now. You're learning the rest of the story.
Yeah, well, if anybody ever wants to do a second edition, but I'll have to find Elon Musk.
Yeah, you gotta. I mean, I feel like he'd be the kind of quirky guy to get into something like that. There's probably a bunch of weird rich people out there. That's my hope. I hope I can just stop working one day, like a rich person, listen to the podcast, and like, here's $50,000 a year to do the podcast. Like, all right, good. That's my job now.
Okay.
But it hasn't happened yet. So
yeah, well,
I'm still grinding. So what you had, you said you do have a couple works submitted to the publisher. Which on Rome, what time periods did you look into?
First century AD. Yeah, I mean, one is basically trying to do a year in the Roman life, but the year in question is the year of Vesuvius, because I've never really seen anything of that just takes what is a typical Roman year in the first century AD. And 79, it wasn't just a matter of, yes, Vesuvius blew up. There was an awful lot of political intrigue going on as well. So there's just enough primary source material and archaeological material that we can build an actual book length thing month by month.
So did you, that Vesuvius is like 10 years after the year of the four emperors, right?
Correct.
I'm trying to, it's been a while since we did Rome.
Absolutely.
So we're getting into the very early stages of the Flavian dynasty and all the drama that came with that in the early days.
Well, this is the year that Vespasian died and Titus took over.
Okay.
So he dies in June. The eruption is in October, they now posit. So Titus, who's a really interesting character in his own right for a lot of reasons, is presented with his first crisis. But everything up to that point, there's a whole lot going on that year politically that, as well as, people forget, we go to the supermarket and there's food. Well, no, if you read the records, this was the year where there wasn't a whole lot of food.
So I'm sure, like with as with any significant natural occurrence, I'm sure there's lots of people in those sources who are blaming the eruption of Vesuvius on the death of whatchamacallit. I can't think of his name right now.
Vespasian.
Vespasian. Because that's usually, like, every time an important person dies, it seems like the primary source is always like, well, this natural disaster happened. There was a big tidal wave, all the fish died, there was a huge thunderstorm, there was an earthquake.
Well, that's where it gets interesting, because not really. The later writers on this period, the Tacitus and Pliny the Younger and Suetonius, they don't have any beef with Vespasian or really much with Titus. It's the youngest brother, Domitian, they really couldn't stand. Rightly or wrongly, there are arguments to be made, but for whatever reason, they really didn't like him. So in order to make him look even worse, they tended to be pretty nice towards Vespasian, certainly, and Titus, even though he was a very strange character. But no, as far as I can tell, nobody was really giving Titus too much grief. And it must be said that he did a really good job on emergency relief right afterwards.
Well, I guess that's the perspective of being a successful military commander. When tragedies happen, you're prepared for it, and you just automatically go into, this is what we need to do to get this situation fixed.
Exactly so. So, no, it gets interesting.
So is that the only project you did on Rome, or do you do another one that you're still waiting to hear if it's going to get approved or not?
Well, I'm that and another one which has to deal with Flavians as well. As I say, they're a very interesting family, and I think they've been a little underserved and as a dynasty.
I've been meaning to get back to them. Like, my Roman history is good up until like the end of the Julio Claudians, and then after that, I know a little bit about the Julius, or the Great Jewish Revolt. I know about like Flavius and Titus because they're connected to that story. But like right about there, it starts getting hazy. I'm like, yeah, the emperors are good for a while, and then it sort of falls off, and then it comes back a little bit.
Well, the year of 4 emperors is just it's a Benny Hill show. It's
yeah. This person was emperor for 3 months. This one was here for 2 months. What, isn't the guy there for like 6 weeks or something like that? He's emperor until he gets replaced.
Blink and you miss it. But so yeah, no, that's another one that we're trying to sell, but sounds perfect for you.
Yeah, well, I'm at the mercy of the patrons. They vote on the show.
Well, it's perfect for them as well.
Yeah, I've been trying to talk him into it for like a year and a half now, but they're not biting. I guess I just keep putting too many other interesting topics.
Well,
even though I'm kind of dreading our next move into the Anglo-Saxon period, heading back into the Dark Ages and the god-awful sources that entails.
Yeah, well, a lot of made-up stories.
No, yeah. I mean, at a certain point, you kind of have to. When the Royal Chronicle tells you like 2 events that happened this year, you kind of got to use your imagination to fill in the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
We did Charlemagne about a year and a half ago, and I hated it. I can't stand Dark Ages, and supposedly he's the most written about source in the Dark Ages. So I'm like, oh god, here we go. Well, after this, no more Dark Ages. The only exception being Justinian.
I was about to say Byzantine stuff would be right up your alley.
Yeah, well, the most Byzantine we did was the fall of Constantinople and their involvement in the First Crusade and subsequent crusades.
Well, Justinian and Belisarius and all that crew, that's pretty interesting stuff.
Well, they did pretty well. I think that came in second place. It's just the Anglo-Saxons have been a voting topic for like 3 seasons, and The Last Kingdom is popular on Netflix. Everybody wants to see her. Oh, is Uhtred of Bebbanburgh real? Like, no.
No.
Or at least if he is, he's not as significant as he is in the show. He didn't win the Battle of Effendin and all the other old Anglo-Saxon names I can't pronounce.
Bear in mind that that series is based on a novel.
Yes, it's a fiction story.
I have nothing against novels, but in fact, I approve of them. But
I do, because some of these writers try to make it seem like it's a history of the series, and I won't do enough research on what I'm buying, and I'll buy it and I'll open it up. It's like, this person was madly in love. I'm like, just close it, throw it away. I'm not using that. It's not history. There may have been interesting insights in there, but I can't trust it because they're a fiction writer, and all fiction writers are liars.
Well, so are a lot of historians, for that matter.
Well, at least with historians, we can always claim we were deceived. Like, well, I believe this one person, but we were really incorrect.
I tried. I really tried.
Yeah, we're like politicians, We're like, well, the data was wrong. We'll just have to try again later. Or weathermen, depending on whichever profession you want to laugh at more.
Well, that's what I'm finding interesting about the whole Flavian period, because there are so few sources, and you're trying to figure out, is this person telling the truth or not? They were all writing after the death of Domitian, and the new boss in town kind of got there after Domitian was assassinated. Well, okay, I used to work for the old emperor, but now I'm working for you, and I really didn't like him at all. Well, fair enough, we believe you up to a point, but you were still working for him.
I mean, if you want to see the reality of people who tell these kind of truths, all you have to do is learn the story of Machiavelli. Like, a talented statesman and diplomat falls foul of the wrong party in the revolution, and then he's stuck to writing historians about how princes are all bad and they're all scheming against the common people.
He's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I was planning on doing an episode on him one time, and then it was with somebody else, and things didn't go well. So I just have a bunch of like Machiavelli facts just banging around in my head that I've never used. I should probably actually publish that episode myself sometimes, but he's a fascinating figure.
Well, throw it in as a gimme. Yeah,
he's well, for one, he's interesting because he's controversial. It automatically makes the story more interesting. It's on the Catholic Church's banned books list. It gets a little air of controversy about it. But the reality is, if you read the book, it's mostly just stuff that, as someone who has even like an amateurish view of history, it's like, yeah, that makes sense. He's using history to back up all of the points he's making.
Well, he wrote a long commentary on the histories of Livy, so it's not like he didn't know what he was talking about.
Yeah, and he's in the Renaissance, when everybody's rediscovering the old Roman world and finding it's just as fascinating as we find it today, because it's it's an inherently fascinating period.
Though I always think the politicians of today wouldn't last 2 minutes in Renaissance Italy.
Pretty much any other time except for now, because for one, they would be expected to fight in the front lines of battle, which there's maybe like 15 or 20 people in the entire House of Representatives or the legislative branch as a whole who I would trust in battle.
Right.
And most of them are actual combat veterans who use that to become politicians in the first place.
Well, that's one of the points you got getting back to Malta, is you see the people who are running the operation on the front lines, and they're all, geriatric cases, and they're still there.
Yeah, and they're still killing people.
Yeah.
It's like, I did an episode with another guy on Skanderbeg, and when I give him the final casualty figures, he's like, that's not possible. I was like, you have to realize this guy died in his mid-50s.
Right.
He spent at least 35 to 40 of those years killing people. Like, it's not that far-fetched to believe that man killed 3,000 people in his lifetime. Right. Especially when he won 13 battles and the routes and all the slaughter and massacre that happens in them. Like, when you do the math, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, he only has to kill 30 people per battle, and he's got his he's got his 3,000 quota by the end of the time he's dead.
It's one of the things that sort of wonder, how would Malta have gone if Suleiman had gone in person instead of sending two guys? And did he realize that they were going to be squabbling with each other, or did that not occur to him? And
or
I sort of
perhaps he would
wonder.
have died anyway. Suleiman's a year away from death. Like maybe he goes to Malta, the hot sun and the privations, and just kill him.
Well, possibly. I mean, but on the other hand, it might have invigorated him.
Yeah, that's true too. Get away from the squalor of Istanbul.
All you're getting is people giving him a hard time at home. Why is he going? I mean, he's going out on this thing in the first place because his daughter says they stole my ship of expensive trade goods. Go get them. Okay, dear.
Well, that's the official story anyway. If you look at it from the strategic point, it's Malta's the perfect stepping stone to attacking Italy.
No, I get it, but everybody's got mixed motives.
Oh yeah, of course. That's always, you have to wonder how many decisions were made throughout history just because somebody overheard somebody say something and said,
Sure,
that's an interesting idea. Let's go with that. I mean, you have to remember all the people making these historical decisions. They're people just like us. They're subject to the same biases and fears and social conditioning that make them do whatever they're doing.
it's one of the things that I liked about this particular episode, though, was just how varied the different people were. And they come out as real characters in ways that, a lot of other histories, your Vikings, for example, just don't.
Yeah, well, I think part of that is just because, sometimes it's the most boring person's record to survive. I mean, you think about how many fantastic historical accounts that we have today. And then we think about all of the cities throughout history who have been sacked and burned and flooded and hit with natural disasters. Like there could be, like, for instance, just talk about your thing with the Flavians. Like there could have been 1,000 fantastic books on them throughout history that just got burned by the Vikings, or when the castle fell over, or when the river overflowed its banks and flooded the library. That's kind of the most depressing thing about this business. Is like just sitting there thinking sometimes, like, man, what have we lost? Like supposedly we only have like less of a percentage point of all the books that have ever been written throughout history that we have access to.
Mind you, a lot of them are fairly dull. On the other hand, there are huge archives throughout Europe that people haven't really looked into. People still turn up things that they never expected. Who knows what's there?
Yeah, I mean, the big conspiracy on the internet, the Vatican archives is the one you have to break into. You have to do the Mission Impossible to get in there to find all the secrets of the Catholic Church and the history of the world, or whatever, depending on how far you want to go down that conspiracy rabbit trail.
Yeah, well, most of them are just entries: 6 candlesticks, 5 sheep.
Yeah, but pretty soon someone's going to find up the one where the Pope's just invented Jesus. That's the big find that everybody's hoping for. It's the Al Capone's vault of history.
Yeah, and it's always a disappointment.
Yeah, well, generally, but every now and again, you came looking for copper and you found gold.
No, that's true.
You tried to turn pea into gold and you created gunpowder. It's just sometimes it's the accidents that make it all worthwhile. So I'm going to get a little bit back. I'm going to try to dig into your writing process. Like when you're looking at primary sources, like which ones do you try to, do you think a direct eyewitness or like an official historian is a better view? Because on one hand, you have someone who's like, oh, well, I was there, I saw this, but at the same time, that person's account of what happened might be unreliable, and it might be better to look at someone who's writing about this afterwards, who's interviewing a bunch of people after they've all had a chance to calm down, as it were.
Well, unfortunately, with this sort of thing, there are few enough records that you can contain most of them. It's not like doing World War II. I don't know how anybody deals with that. It's
That's
just
too easy.
well, it's too easy, but it's also too hard. There's too much stuff.
And you're going to get emails from people who are going to disagree because they were there.
Yeah, that too. Well,
Oh, well, I was in, you said it was this, but it was really this.
well, you're going to get those letters anyway. But no, it seems to me that this particular period has got sort of the perfect balance of too much and not enough. You do have the Balby characters. You do have Bosio, who's, his thing is huge. And he did talk with a good number of people. And there is enough stuff that is actually contemporary. So you can more or less digest what was done at the time. You'll feel stuffed, but you won't feel like so overwhelmed that you couldn't possibly do it at all.
I found like when it comes to researching, you have to pick your first source carefully.
Right.
Because like no matter how you try to set into it with an analytical mind, like when you look at something and you hear something different, your brain is automatically going to register the memory of, wait a minute, this conflicts with what I heard the first time.
Yeah, and you tend, whether you like it or not, to believe the first thing you heard.
Yeah.
So you have to guard against that as well. No, I generally will go to, okay, who is basically the go-to person writing currently, and then immediately go to the bibliography. And from there, go to the original sources. So working backwards, what have you come up with? What should I be looking at? And what's surprising, it doesn't happen as often as it might, but if you read footnotes and you chase down footnotes, and I'm retentive enough that I actually do that, you find people making stuff up.
I mean, at a certain point, history, it's not an exact science, because at the end of the day, it's all just your opinion on what happened versus somebody else's. So, I mean, sometimes you got to pick. You got three balls up in the air, and they all say something different. You got to decide which one to catch, and that's the one you live with.
Here's the thing of it. Cleo is the muse of history. The muses were not science. The muses were the arts.
Yeah, that is true.
Though, yeah, well, one is sort of the stars, but she's an exception.
Well, there's definitely, I'm sure you can attest this the same. There's plenty of historians who should have spent a little bit more time in art class before they decided to sit down and write their magnum opus.
Oh, yeah, well.
There's some historians out there who can't write to save their lives. It's like you have, actually, I just had a tweet about this the other day. Actually, we're going to do a little social media promotion. I'll just read it on the show here.
Go for it.
I said, if a historian / content creator can't write a compelling story on Malta, they're a shit writer. The story is already 9.5 out of 10. All you had to do was arrange the facts and get the names and date right. It's like whiffing on a 50-mile-an-hour fastball. Like, I mean, unfortunately, I didn't get Giacomo Bosio. I didn't know about him until I was already like halfway through researching, and like, well, it's too late to buy him now. But like, just with Balby alone, I'm like, this is a 10 out of 10 screenplay right here. Like, I could just read that book on the show, and I could make an interesting story out of this. Like, how did you screw it up? I don't understand.
Guy Ritchie was actually planning on doing a movie on the Siege of Malta, but his then wife said, "No, sweetie, let's do a remake of Swept Away, and then we can do it." That bombed, and Guy Ritchie went back to doing London Crime.
Damn, that's a shame. I would have liked to seen that movie.
Yeah.
But like, it seems like there's far more like historical movies out these days, especially on like a content platform like Amazon. They're just all terrible. They're all made by someone who had like a shoestring budget. It's like these great events of history just look terrible because your CGI is extremely obvious. It's a shame. I was watching one on the Siege of Vienna, and like I had this picture of the battle in my head that was done really well by the historians who talked about it. And then I watched it on screen. I'm like, this is boring. This is not at all how I pictured it in my head.
Well, if you know any producers, I have ideas.
Oh, I've got plenty of ideas too, believe me. I just have them go through my catalog of shows that I've done, and you've got a dozen good movies right there. Alexander the Great, the fall of the Roman Republic from Julius Caesar to Octavian and the Julio Claudians, Charlemagne, the
Mm.
fall of Constantinople, the Balkan Wars. You could do 20 movies. You could do a whole like 10 season miniseries on just the figures of the 15th century in the Balkans that all lived at the same time.
Well, this one, what I think you should do, what I'd like to do, I need to get in touch with people who have money and influence.
Yeah, send them my way too when you find them.
You know, no, to do it week by week, following the course of an actual summer. Start in late spring and end in August, and in September. Why not? There's enough. In every week of that entire siege, there is something interesting going on.
Like with a siege like Malta, you almost have to do it visually because
Yeah.
like I've run into this problem all the time just trying to do it verbally, is like just trying to describe the geography of what's happening.
Yeah.
Like I'm sitting here talking about an event that has 20 different points of interest that I'm just like scrambling to try to make sure I get all of them right and still make that somehow coherent to somebody listening at home. Like what does the post of Don Francisco mean to somebody who's listening to me just throw that name out and keep right on going?
Right.
But you know, if you could see it, if you could see the bullet holes and the cannonballs and Don Francisco standing on the battlements and getting hit with a cannonball and killed, that just makes it inherently more interesting and easy to understand.
Mm. Well, if you could get his consortium of European types, after all, every country there has got some connection to it.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to lean into that, like as I'm writing this next episode, about how like the Grand Corsico of Malta is the wet dream of every pope from like Charlotte, from Constantine until now. Like it's a pan-European force that even the Protestants are cheering for. It's led by the Spanish king, who's the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, controller of most of Europe, at the final advance point in the Mediterranean of the Ottoman Empire. And it all happens on one island led by soldiers of the Pope, essentially.
Right.
I mean, that's what the popes have been trying to do since the First Crusade and before then. And it's just when you think about all the different moving parts that are happening in this siege, you can't just help but like sit back and be like, whoa, that's impressive.
Yeah, that's what I like Garcia de Toledo. I don't think he gets enough good press. I mean, he's trying to manage the whole thing with a bunch of really obstreperous people who think they know better than he does.
Well, that's the one of my favorite lines in Balbi, is when he's talking about like when the Great Relief lands, he says, well, if they had only done this and this and this, we could have captured all the Ottoman cannons. And he says, but I wasn't in the council tents. I didn't know what the orders of the king were. And this is what happens in history. People get carried away and then he moves on. I'm like, you know what, Balbi, I respect you for that. Which I feel like that should be the forward of every historian's work from then on. Then they should have that quote just plastered on the front of the book, like, this is what I think happened, but I wasn't there.
No, that's good. I like it.
So it really makes me, it's one of those things that builds the trust between the reader and the historian, or just the casual person looking at it. Is you get those little glimmers of humanity where the guy says, listen, I'm not perfect, I might have screwed this up, but this is how I remembered it.
Anyway, a good time was had by all. So
yeah, you know, he got to shoot a bunch of Turks. They got revenge on all the raiding they'd been doing for the past few decades. It's a good time.
And I got paid off.
Yeah, actually, it was another idea that just I've been sort of bouncing around. Like the Siege of Malta, or 1565 in general, was probably the safest year to send a trade ship on the Mediterranean in hundreds of years.
That's
because
true.
All of the pirates on both sides were all in one place. Like if you were a Muslim shipper, the Knights of the Knights of St. John are trapped on Malta, and if you're a Christian shipper, pretty much all the Barbary corsairs are at Malta. It must have been the greatest year ever to sail on the Mediterranean. So I had one other question. I'm trying to remember what it was. hate that when it happens. I had it. It was in the ether, and I can't pull it out. I'm getting writer's block on the spot.
Walt in general, or history in general?
Yeah, well, that happens to everyone. You know, you can't throw out your A game every day. You know, eventually you gotta have some B and C games. So just to confirm with you one more, so you don't have anything that's officially coming out yet? Like there's nothing aside from your works of.
It's been a bad 2 years.
Wow, geez, that sucks.
Yeah, well,
start a podcast. Do what I did. Go out and talk to the fans directly.
It may come to that. No, it's I have certain ideas on that, how that might be done. I used to do a blog, but again, I probably took it too seriously, and the amount of time I put into each write-up was just taking too much time.
I tell you though, it's worth it. Because I felt that way when I started, you know, when I only had a couple dozen people listening to the show. And then like I sold some advertising space, and then I got my first like 1,000 listeners in a day. And like after that, I just got bit by the bug. I was like, I'm going to be doing this the rest of my life. You know, the fact that this many people found the idea I had about history interesting, it just, I've been swept away ever since.
I have an idea or two. You inspired me. I'm going to look into it further.
Well, if you need any help, you can definitely email me. I'll give you some technical help and help you set everything up. All you need is a mic and a publishing platform, and you're good to go.
There is that.
You just get behind the mic, and well, if you have the more analytical approach, I would recommend typing up a script and, you know, actually doing your research. But who knows, you might find yourself give you something to do while you're waiting for your next book to get approved, or if you're going on a lecture tour or whatever. That's how I started. I had nothing better to do, and now I'm doing it as part of my job for a living.
Excellent.
And then, yeah, the greatest thing is, didn't have to go to a minute of school for it. Didn't have to pay any money out of my own pocket to learn all this, except for the money to buy books, of course.
Yeah, well, that can add up.
Oh, yeah, believe me, it does. Of course, you no doubt spent far more than I did. I spent probably $300 in all on sources, but I imagine it costs a bit more to write a book as extensive as yours was.
Yeah, oddly enough, you never know where they're going to hit. I actually paid more money out of the Polish translation than I did from the English.
Yeah, that's the issue. As someone who just speaks English, you know, you're missing out on so much, because most of the best histories are all still in the primary source language that they were written in. I mean, how many fascinating writers are there out there that, you know, we can't understand?
Well, that's one reason why I try to stick into areas where I actually can read what they've got to say.
You're getting to the point in history, at least around the Siege of Malta, where you can actually almost understand what they're saying in English.
Oh, you can. Well, I mean, I actually do have quite a few citations of what the English ambassadors were saying at the time. They were keeping really close tabs on the whole thing.
Well, you know, it's funny because I can tell that at least my copy of Balbi was written by an Englishman, because when the Piccolo Corsico comes in, there's 2 English knights that come along, and they get name dropped. It's like, really? You had to tell us about these 2 English dudes that were there? Like, no doubt this guy is from the UK somewhere, because he just had to throw in, oh, there was 2 Englishmen here at the siege, aside from, was it Lavalette's translator or something like that? His Latin historian was the only English guy in the order at the time.
Right. Yeah, apparently he was trying to get out of Malta, the story goes, and trying to come back to England, but they wouldn't let him. Rumor is that his ghost is still haunting his one-time house, which is the I remember right, the consulate office of the Russian Federation. I pray it's true.
Well, you never know you never know how many graves we're standing on right now. you think about it, just like every time they try to dig a subway in Rome, they run into another Roman ruin.
Right.
It's like, oh, there was a temple here. We got another 50 feet of this subway dug, and we had to stop for another 3 years while the archaeologists dug everything up and moved it.
Yeah, it's where did all this stuff come from?
Yeah,
Why?
we're just standing on top of it.
But it's not. I mean, there's garbage in the street, but it's not that bad. Surely, I suppose after 2,000 years, it is that bad.
Yeah. Well, it's just the years of dirt and dust settle, and we've just slowly been getting higher and higher and higher.
You don't
it's
see
like
that
the saying
happening.
goes, every time you paint the room, it gets smaller.
Well,
It's the
that's
same way
true.
with the dirt.
So is this going to happen with New York City?
Maybe. I would imagine
Maybe.
that San Francisco would be the first one to go, considering it's already sitting on top of a trash pile to begin with,
Yeah,
next to
no.
a major fault line. It's a wonder that whole state hasn't just sort of fallen off the entire United States at this point.
Well.
They must
Same
mean that
thing.
somebody important died. There was an earthquake. That's what history tells us. Every time somebody important dies, there's an earthquake. It's either the earth trembling because it's lost a mighty hero, or it's hell trying to spit them back out, depending on which historian you're reading and which figure we're talking about.
Plus, I understand that out in some farm, someplace, there was a lamb born with 3 heads. It's got to mean something.
Yes, the one of my favorites was the goose that was leading the way to the Holy Land during the First Crusade. There was a goose that supposedly was filled with the Holy Spirit and was leading this group of crusaders to Constantinople. It instead led them to a village full of Jews who they promptly killed and burned the village down and went back home again.
Okay, so are we supposed to consider this goose a hero or a villain?
Yes, well, I guess that all depends what sources you're listening to. Same thing, the Jewish sources will probably say, "May that goose's bones be crushed," because they love saying that.
Yeah, well, I think I'm probably with them on this occasion.
Well, it's been fun today talking with Bruce here. If you get the chance and you want to check out the Great Siege of Malta, his book, I definitely recommend it. It's one of the better sources I've read for this siege. Although, I mean, I did get a pretty terrible hand. I chose very poorly when it came to some of the sources here, but there was definitely enough between his book and some of the other ones that I found that we had a fascinating story. So fingers crossed his future works get approved. And do you want to say anything before we go?
No, I think that sums it up. It was fun. Let's do it again. I'll try to get something to work on for you.
Yeah. Well, like I said, if you ever need any help starting your podcast, email me and I'll set you right up.
Sounds reasonable to me.
All right. I hope you guys all enjoyed today's episode, and I'll catch you on the next one.